They found the letter 3 weeks after I'd slipped it under the Kingdom Hall door at 2 in the morning, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the envelope. For 41 years, I'd woken up at 5:30 every Tuesday to press my dress, polish my ministry bag, and rehearse my presentation for field service. For 41 years, I'd sat in that same third row, right side, nodding at every word from the platform as if my life depended on it. Maybe it did. The letter was simple. 7 sentences. I told them I couldn't participate in the judicial committee they'd scheduled for me. I told them I was resigning as a regular pioneer. I didn't tell them why, because how could I explain what happened in those 3 months without sounding like I'd lost my mind? How could I make them understand that the sister who'd given comments at every Watchtower study, who'd auxiliary pioneered every April for 2 decades, who'd hosted the circuit overseer 4 times in her modest apartment in Manchester, had discovered something that shattered everything? My daughter Jennifer stopped answering my calls on a Thursday. My son Michael sent a text message that said only, "Mom, you know what you've done," and blocked my number. The elders announced my disfellowshipping on a Tuesday evening in September, and I wasn't there to hear it, but my neighbor Sarah was. She texted me the exact words: "Margaret Thompson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses." 23 words followed by complete silence from everyone I'd known for 4 decades. But here's what they didn't announce. What I'd found in my grandson's medical records that June afternoon. What the elders told me when I brought it to them in July. What happened in that back room in August when I refused to stay quiet. 3 months. That's all it took to go from exemplary to expelled, from pioneer to pariah, from faithful servant to what they whisper about in the Kingdom Hall parking lot now, dangerous apostate. And I'm about to tell you exactly what changed, because somebody needs to hear this story. Somebody needs to know that asking questions doesn't make you wicked, and that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is walk away. My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm 57 years old. I was baptized at 16 in a Kingdom Hall in Brisbane, Australia, where my parents had moved us from Sydney 2 years earlier for my father's job transfer. I married Robert Thompson when I was 19, a ministerial servant with a bright future in the organization. We moved to Manchester, England, in 1995 when his company relocated him, and we never left. We raised 2 children in the truth. We hosted book studies in our living room for 12 years. I logged over 15,000 hours in the ministry over 4 decades. I'm telling you these details because I need you to understand something crucial. I wasn't a weak Christian looking for an excuse to leave. I wasn't stumbled by someone's imperfection or nursing a grudge over some petty congregation drama. I didn't leave because I wanted to celebrate birthdays or because I fell into immorality or because I got tired of meeting attendance. Those are the explanations they're spreading about me now in whispered conversations after the meetings, the narratives that make my departure easier for them to digest, more palatable, less threatening. The truth is far more disturbing, and that's precisely why they labeled me an apostate. I discovered something they couldn't let me talk about. I asked questions they couldn't let me ask. And when I refused to be silent, when I insisted that protecting children mattered more than protecting the organization's reputation, they moved with a swiftness that still takes my breath away when I think about it too long on sleepless nights. Before I walk you through those 3 months that changed everything, I need to ask you something. If you're watching this, if you're listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. More importantly, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. I need to know that someone out there is willing to hear what happened to me, to us, to countless others whose stories never get told because the fear of losing everyone you love is too overwhelming, too paralyzing, too absolute. I spent 3 weeks debating whether to share this story publicly. 3 weeks weighing my children's shunning, my grandchildren's faces that I'm no longer allowed to see, my former friends' averted eyes at the supermarket, against the possibility that speaking up might protect someone else's grandchild. In the end, there was no debate at all. Some things matter more than comfort, more than acceptance, more than family dinners and birthday cards and Christmas mornings I'll never get back anyway since we didn't celebrate them to begin with. So comment below with your city. Let me see who's listening. Let me know this matters. And then settle in, because what I'm about to tell you is going to take some time, and it's not going to be easy to hear. But I promise you this, every word is true. June 14th started like any other Thursday had started for the past 23 years. My alarm buzzed at 5:30, and I was already mentally reviewing the day's schedule before my feet hit the bedroom floor. Field service at 9:30 with Sister Patricia and Sister Yolanda, both pioneers like myself who'd been working the Chorlton territory with me for the better part of a decade. After service, I'd grab a quick lunch, then head to the Kingdom Hall to help Sister Deborah prepare for the midweek meeting, setting up chairs, organizing literature, making sure the sound system was functioning properly. Robert would meet me there after his shift at the warehouse, and we'd sit in our usual spot, third row right side, the same seats we'd occupied since 2001 when Brother Harrison had been the presiding overseer and Sister Margaret Price, whom I'd been named after by pure coincidence, was still alive and pioneering at 86 years old. I'd pressed my navy dress the night before, the one with the modest neckline and hem that fell precisely 2 inches below my knee, the one I'd purchased at Marks & Spencer specifically for ministry because it had pockets deep enough for my tract supply and didn't wrinkle easily when I spent 3 hours walking the residential streets of South Manchester. My ministry bag was already packed. The revised edition of the New World Translation, my well-worn copy of the reasoning book with at least 40 sticky notes marking frequently used scriptures, a stack of the latest Watchtower and Awake magazines, return visit slips, a pen that never seemed to run out of ink no matter how many Bible studies I started, and a small notebook where I meticulously recorded every door, every conversation, every tiny seed planted in 41 years of faithful service. The morning went exactly as planned until it didn't. Patricia had canceled last minute, something about her daughter Emma needing help with the new baby, her third grandchild born just 6 weeks earlier. Yolanda and I worked the territory alone, covering the stretch of Barlow Moor Road we'd been assigned, knocking on doors that rarely opened anymore, leaving literature in doorways, marking down the knotted homes for future visits. We talked between doors about the upcoming circuit assembly, about Sister Linda's recent diagnosis that the congregation was praying about the new family that had just moved into our hall from London, about everything and nothing, the comfortable conversation of 2 women who'd spent thousands of hours together in this peculiar work. By 11:30, we'd finished our territory and decided to stop for coffee at the Café Nero near the bus stop. This was our routine, this brief window of fellowship before the afternoon responsibilities claimed us again. Yolanda ordered her usual cappuccino, and I got my black coffee with 1 sugar, and we sat by the window watching the Thursday morning traffic crawl past, the Manchester drizzle that never quite qualified as real rain coating the windows in that distinctly British way that I'd learned to appreciate over 28 years of living in this grey, industrial, strangely beautiful city that had become more home than Brisbane ever was. My phone rang at 11:47. I remember the exact time because I glanced at my watch, an old Timex that Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary, wondering who would be calling during field service hours. It was Jennifer, my daughter, her voice tight with something that I couldn't quite identify, but that made my chest constrict immediately. She said she was at Manchester Children's Hospital with my grandson Ethan, who was 7 years old and the absolute light of my existence. She said there'd been an incident at school, that Ethan had finally told his teacher about something that had been happening, that they were in the emergency department, that she needed me there now. Not in an hour, not after I'd finished my coffee and caught the bus, but immediately. I left Yolanda sitting there with both our coffees growing cold, her face registering confusion as I grabbed my ministry bag and rushed out into that perpetual Manchester mist. The bus ride to the hospital took 23 minutes that felt like 23 hours, and I prayed the entire way, reciting every scripture about Jehovah's protection that I'd memorized over 4 decades, begging for my grandson's safety, for whatever incident had happened to be minor, for this to be some terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved by afternoon. I prayed the way they'd taught us to pray, specific and faithful, claiming Jehovah's promises, trusting in his organization and his appointed elders and his perfect wisdom that I'd never once questioned in 41 years of devoted service. When I arrived at the Children's Hospital, Jennifer was in a small consultation room with a doctor and a woman who introduced herself as Sarah Mackenzie from Social Services. The air in that room felt heavy, oppressive, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Ethan was with a nurse, Jennifer explained, being examined, and I felt my legs weaken at the implication of those words. The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and a Pakistani accent, spoke carefully, precisely, using words that didn't fully register at first because my brain couldn't process what she was describing. Ethan had disclosed sexual abuse. The abuse had been ongoing for approximately 2 years. The perpetrator was someone within the family's close circle, someone trusted, someone who had regular access to Ethan during congregation activities and family gatherings. The hospital had followed mandatory reporting protocols. The police had been notified. An investigation was beginning immediately. Jennifer sat beside me, trembling, her face pale and streaked with tears, and I reached for her hand because that's what mothers do. That's what we've always done. We reach for our children when the world collapses around them, even when we can't quite grasp what's collapsing or why. I asked the question that would change everything, though I didn't know it yet. I asked who? The doctor looked at the social worker, who looked at Jennifer, who looked at me with eyes that held something I'd never seen in her face before, something that looked horribly like fear and betrayal and rage, all mixed together in a toxic combination that made my stomach lurch. She said the name, and the room tilted sideways, and I heard myself make a sound that didn't seem human, didn't seem possible, because the name she said was Brother Marcus Fletcher, a ministerial servant in our congregation, a man I'd known for 15 years, a man who'd been in my home countless times, a man whose wife Carol I'd pioneered alongside every Thursday for the past 3 years. I spent that first weekend in a fog that felt physical, as if I were walking through water, or trying to breathe through cotton wool. Robert and I sat at our kitchen table on Saturday morning, the Watchtower Study edition lying unopened between us, and tried to make sense of what couldn't possibly make sense. Ethan had been interviewed by specially trained police officers on Friday afternoon. He disclosed details that Jennifer had shared with us in broken sentences, facts so horrific that I'd vomited twice on Friday night and couldn't eat anything on Saturday except dry toast that sat in my stomach like concrete. Brother Fletcher had started grooming Ethan 2 years ago during congregation picnics and social gatherings, giving him special attention, small gifts, teaching him card tricks, gradually building trust while isolating him from other children and adults. The abuse had escalated during congregation field service arrangements when Fletcher had volunteered to take Ethan in his car group, claiming he was mentoring the boy, preparing him for baptism, investing in his spiritual future. Jennifer and her husband David had trusted Fletcher completely, had been grateful that a ministerial servant was taking such interest in their son's spiritual development, had encouraged the relationship because that's what you do in Jehovah's organization. You trust your brothers and sisters, especially those appointed by Holy Spirit to positions of responsibility. On Monday morning, I called the congregation. I spoke to Brother Edwards, our presiding overseer, a man I'd known for 19 years. A man who'd conducted my father-in-law's funeral service, a man who'd encouraged me when I'd first started pioneering, who'd given parts on the service meeting about my ministry success. I told him what had happened to Ethan. I told him about the police investigation. I told him that Brother Fletcher needed to be removed from his position immediately, and that the congregation needed to be warned because there might be other children, other victims who hadn't found the courage to speak yet. Brother Edwards listened in silence. When I finished, there was a pause that stretched too long, that felt wrong, that made my hands start shaking again like they'd shaken when I delivered that letter 3 months later. He asked if there were 2 witnesses to the abuse. I said what any reasonable person would say. No, of course not. Abusers don't molest children in front of witnesses. That's precisely why they're able to continue for so long. He asked if Ethan's testimony was reliable given his age. I felt something crack inside my chest, some foundation that I didn't know could crack, and I said yes, his testimony was reliable. The police believed him, the doctors believed him, the social workers believed him, and I certainly believed him because 7-year-old children don't fabricate detailed accounts of sexual abuse. Brother Edwards explained the organization's policy to me, as if I were a new Bible study student who didn't understand basic theocratic procedures. He said that accusations of wrongdoing required 2 witnesses according to Deuteronomy 19:15 and 1 Timothy 5:19. He said that without a second witness to corroborate Ethan's testimony, the elders couldn't take judicial action against Brother Fletcher. He said that while they took abuse allegations seriously, they also had to be careful not to slander a faithful brother based on uncorroborated claims. He said that the matter would be handled according to scriptural direction and organizational guidelines, that I needed to trust the process, trust Jehovah's arrangement, trust the elders whom Jehovah had appointed through Holy Spirit. I sat there holding my phone, listening to words that couldn't possibly be real, that couldn't possibly be coming from a man I'd respected for nearly 2 decades. I asked what would happen if there were other victims, if other children came forward, if the police investigation revealed a pattern of abuse. Brother Edwards said that each case would be evaluated individually according to scriptural requirements. He said that the congregation would not be informed of the allegations because doing so could constitute slander against Brother Fletcher if the accusations proved false. He said that I needed to be very careful about what I said to others in the congregation because spreading unsubstantiated claims about a brother's conduct could result in judicial action against me for causing divisions. That was the moment. That was the precise second when something fundamental shifted inside me, when 41 years of unquestioning loyalty met an immovable obstacle called moral clarity. I said something I never said to an elder in my entire life. I said no. I said I would not be silent. I said that protecting children was more important than protecting the organization's reputation. I said that if the elders wouldn't warn the congregation about a predator in their midst, then I would do it myself, because I couldn't live with myself if another child was harmed when I could have prevented it. Brother Edwards's tone changed. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something cold and administrative. He said that if I persisted in making accusations without scriptural substantiation, if I caused division in the congregation by spreading reports about Brother Fletcher, if I went ahead of Jehovah's organization by taking matters into my own hands, then the elders would have no choice but to form a judicial committee to address my conduct. He said that apostasy included speaking against the organization's scriptural procedures. He said that I needed to think very carefully about what I was about to do, about the consequences for my family, about my relationship with Jehovah. I hung up the phone. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd studied the Watchtower every Saturday morning for 28 years, where I'd prepared countless Bible study lessons, where I'd hosted elders and their wives for dinner, where I'd believed with absolute certainty that I was part of Jehovah's clean organization, his only channel of truth on earth. Robert looked at me across our kitchen table. This man I'd been married to for 38 years. This man who'd been an elder himself until he'd stepped down 5 years ago due to work pressures. This man who'd been raised in the truth just like me. He said, okay. He said, we'll do it together. He said that whatever happened next, we'd face it as a team. Because some things were more important than comfort, more important than congregation acceptance, more important than anything except doing what was right even when it destroyed your entire world. The phone calls started on Tuesday. I contacted 12 families from our congregation who had children between the ages of 5 and 12, families I'd known for years, families whose homes I'd been invited into, whose children I'd seen grow from babies to young people. I didn't dramatize. I didn't embellish. I stated facts. Ethan had been abused by Brother Fletcher. The police were investigating. The elders were not removing Fletcher from his position due to the two-witness rule, and I believed they needed to know so they could protect their children. 3 families thanked me for telling them. 2 families said they'd speak with the elders before making any decisions. 4 families said they trusted Jehovah's organization to handle matters properly and seemed uncomfortable that I'd contacted them at all. 2 families accused me of causing trouble and suggested I was spreading malicious lies about a faithful brother. One sister, Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter Isabella had been in the same field service groups with Brother Fletcher, started crying on the phone and said that Isabella had been having nightmares for months, that she'd become afraid of going to the Kingdom Hall, that Maria had attributed it to childhood anxiety and had never considered there might be a darker reason. Maria took Isabella to the police on Wednesday. Isabella disclosed that Brother Fletcher had abused her as well, though less severely than Ethan, mostly inappropriate touching during field service arrangements. Maria called me afterward, sobbing, thanking me for my courage, asking why the elders hadn't protected their children, why organizational policies seemed designed to protect abusers rather than victims. I had no answer that satisfied either of us because I was asking myself the same questions that were unraveling 41 years of certainty thread by thread. The elders called an emergency meeting on Thursday evening. Brother Edwards, Brother Patterson, and Brother Morrison arrived at our flat at 7:30, their faces grave, their body language stiff and formal. They sat in our living room, the same living room where we'd hosted book study for 12 years, where we'd welcomed circuit overseers and traveling overseers and fellow pioneers for countless meals and encouragement sessions. They didn't accept the tea I offered. They opened their Bibles and their notebooks and their shepherding textbook, and Brother Edwards informed us that a judicial committee had been formed to address serious accusations against me. The charges were causing divisions in the congregation, speaking abusively of those appointed by Jehovah's organization, and promoting apostate thinking by undermining faith in organizational procedures. Brother Edwards read scriptures about not going beyond what is written, about respecting Jehovah's appointed channel, about the dangers of independent thinking that leads people away from the truth. He said that my phone calls to congregation families constituted a campaign against Brother Fletcher without scriptural basis, that I was usurping the elders' authority by warning families about a situation the elders were handling properly according to organizational guidelines. I asked if they'd received Isabella's disclosure. Brother Edwards acknowledged that they had, that there were now 2 children making similar accusations against Brother Fletcher. I asked if this met their evidentiary requirements, if 2 separate victims constituted sufficient corroboration for judicial action. Brother Patterson, who'd always seemed kind and reasonable in previous interactions, explained that the 2-witness rule required 2 witnesses to the same incident, not 2 separate incidents with 1 witness each. He said that while the elders were taking the allegations seriously and were encouraging families to report to authorities if they felt it necessary, the congregation's judicial process had specific scriptural requirements that couldn't be modified based on personal feelings or secular legal standards. I felt something break open inside me, some dam that had been holding back 41 years of suppressed doubts, suppressed questions, suppressed observations about policies that never quite aligned with common sense or basic human decency. I asked how many children would need to be victimized before organizational policy protected them instead of their abuser. I asked if they truly believed that God cared more about procedural technicalities than children's safety. I asked how they could look at themselves in the mirror knowing they were allowing a predator to remain in good standing in the congregation, while my grandson was in therapy, trying to process trauma that might affect him for the rest of his life. Brother Morrison, the youngest of the 3 elders, looked uncomfortable. Brother Patterson maintained a neutral expression that revealed nothing. Brother Edwards's face hardened, and he said that I was demonstrating precisely the kind of apostate thinking that necessitated this judicial committee. He said that questioning theocratic procedures, suggesting that the organization's policies were flawed, and promoting my own judgment over the faithful and discreet slave's direction were serious matters that indicated a dangerous spiritual condition. The judicial hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening at the Kingdom Hall. Brother Edwards explained the process. I would have the opportunity to present my case, to demonstrate repentance for my actions, to acknowledge that I'd overstepped my authority as a sister in the congregation. If I showed genuine repentance and agreed to stop contacting congregation members with my concerns, if I accepted counsel and committed to supporting the elders' decisions even when I didn't fully understand them, then I might be privately reproved rather than disfellowshipped. However, if I persisted in my current course, if I continued to undermine organizational authority, if I refused to submit to theocratic direction, then disfellowshipping was the only appropriate response to protect the congregation from divisive influences. After the elders left, Robert and I sat in silence for a long time. The television was off. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time that felt surreal and distorted. I kept thinking about all the judicial committees I'd known about over the years, all the times I'd wondered about the details while respecting the confidentiality, all the disfellowshipping announcements I'd heard without questioning whether the process had been fair or just or focused on the right priorities. I thought about Sister Helen who'd been disfellowshipped 10 years ago for celebrating her granddaughter's birthday, about Brother Kevin who'd been publicly reproved for growing a beard, about Sister Rachel who'd been counseled for her skirt length, about all the energy and attention focused on enforcing rules while predators apparently operated with organizational protection, as long as they didn't abuse children in front of witnesses. I drafted a letter that night, a letter I'd revised 3 times before finally delivering it 2 weeks later. I wrote that I would not be attending the Judicial Committee because I didn't recognize its authority to discipline me for protecting children. I wrote that I was resigning as a regular pioneer effective immediately because I could no longer represent an organization whose policies prioritized reputation over child safety. I wrote that I loved Jehovah but could not remain in association with a group that called warning parents about predators and active apostasy. I wrote that I was choosing my conscience over my congregation, my grandson's trauma over my standing in the organization, my moral clarity over 41 years of institutional loyalty. Robert read the letter. He sat down at the table and wrote his own version, resigning as a ministerial servant, stepping down from all theocratic privileges, stating that he could not in good conscience support organizational policies that failed to protect the most vulnerable members. We sealed both letters in separate envelopes, and we held each other in our quiet Manchester flat while the rain that never quite stopped fell against the windows, and we mourned everything we were about to lose. The Judicial Committee met on Tuesday evening without me. I know this because Sarah, my neighbor who was still attending meetings at that point, texted me the next day to tell me that Brother Edwards had announced they'd attempted to meet with me, that I'd refused to appear, that the committee had proceeded in my absence as was their right according to organizational procedure. They disfellowshipped me for apostasy, for causing divisions, for refusing to accept theocratic discipline. The announcement came the following Tuesday. Margaret Thompson is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 23 words that erased 41 years. 23 words that meant every person I'd known in the congregation, every friend I'd pioneered alongside, every family I'd helped during difficult times, every person I'd studied the Bible with, was now required to shun me completely. No greeting at the supermarket. No phone calls to check on my well-being. No acknowledgement of my existence except in whispered conversations about my spiritual downfall, my dangerous apostasy, my cautionary tale of what happens when sisters go ahead of Jehovah's organization. Jennifer stopped answering my calls 3 days after the announcement. I'd drive to her house, and she wouldn't answer the door. I'd text her about Ethan's well-being, about his therapy appointments, about whether he was recovering, and she'd respond with short, cold messages that revealed nothing personal, nothing warm, nothing that acknowledged I was her mother, and she was my daughter, and we'd shared 33 years of life together. Michael was more direct. He sent a long text message explaining that he had to put Jehovah first, that association with a disfellowshipped person would compromise his spiritual standing, that he hoped I'd eventually come to my senses and return to the organization with a repentant heart, but until then, he couldn't have contact with me because his loyalty to God required it. I lost my grandchildren overnight. Ethan, who I'd seen 3 times a week since his birth, who I'd taught to read, who'd helped me bake cookies every Sunday afternoon, who'd called me Nana Maggie in that sweet voice that made my heart expand every time I heard it. Isabella Maria, Michael's daughter, who was 5 and had just started kindergarten, who'd been learning to pioneer in her own childlike way, who'd drawn me pictures that I'd kept in a special box in my closet. Both gone completely, as if I'd died except I hadn't died. I'd just chosen to protect children over protecting organizational reputation. The congregation shunned Robert too, though he hadn't been disfellowshipped formally. He'd resigned his position, he'd submitted his letter questioning organizational policies, and he'd stood by his apostate wife, which was apparently enough to warrant complete social exclusion. The brothers he'd worked alongside for decades didn't return his phone calls. The friends who'd been to our home countless times crossed the street when they saw us coming. The Kingdom Hall that had been the center of our social universe for 28 years became a building we drove past without stopping, a structure full of people who decided we no longer existed. The police investigation continued through July and August. Brother Fletcher was arrested in late July after 2 additional families came forward with abuse allegations involving their children, both of whom had been too frightened to disclose until they heard that other children had been believed and supported. 4 victims total, all between the ages of 6 and 9, all abused during congregation activities and field service arrangements, all groomed by a ministerial servant who'd used his position of trust and spiritual authority to access vulnerable children, while their parents believed their sons and daughters were being mentored in the truth. Into families about what had happened. They held no congregation meeting to address how policies might need to change to prevent future abuse. They simply moved forward as if nothing had occurred, as if 4 children's trauma was an unfortunate incident that didn't require systemic reflection or reform. I spent those 3 months reading everything I'd never allowed myself to read before. I researched the organization's abuse policies, finding documentation of thousands of cases worldwide where children had been failed by the 2-witness rule, where elders had discouraged families from reporting to authorities, where victims had been disfellowshipped for speaking out while their abusers remained in good standing. I read court transcripts and investigative journalism and survivor testimonies and policy documents that revealed a pattern of institutional protection for abusers that stretched back decades. I joined online support groups for former Jehovah's Witnesses, spaces I'd always been taught were full of bitter apostates spreading lies about God's organization. I found instead thousands of people with stories heartbreakingly similar to mine, People who discovered organizational failures and been punished for refusing to stay silent. People who'd lost their families and friends and entire social structures because they'd chosen conscience over compliance. I found therapists who specialized in religious trauma, support networks for people navigating the aftermath of high-control religious groups, resources for rebuilding life outside the only community I'd ever known. Robert and I had long conversations those 3 months, conversations about belief and faith and organization and God, conversations we'd never had in 38 years of marriage because questioning had always felt dangerous, disloyal, potentially spiritually fatal. We talked about whether we still believed in God after discovering our religion had failed us so catastrophically. We talked about what truth meant when the organization we'd believed was truth turned out to be protecting predators. We talked about how to build new lives at 57 and 62 years old when everyone we'd known had disappeared, when we had no social network outside the congregation, when we were starting completely over in ways neither of us had imagined possible 3 months earlier. By September, when I slipped that resignation letter under the Kingdom Hall door at 2 a.m, I'd already grieved most of what I'd lost. I'd already accepted that my children had chosen organizational loyalty over their mother, that my grandchildren would grow up not knowing me, that the community I'd devoted 41 years to building had evaporated the moment I'd prioritized children's safety over institutional reputation. The letter was just formality, just documentation, just my final act of refusing to let them control the narrative about why I'd left. They still call me a dangerous apostate in the Kingdom Hall parking lot. I heard this from Sarah, who eventually left herself after watching how I'd been treated, after realizing that she couldn't remain in association with an organization that handled abuse the way ours had handled Brother Fletcher's crimes. They warn new Bible students about me. Tell them I'm an example of what happens when people develop independent thinking, when they reject theocratic authority, when they put their own judgment above God's organization. They're right about one thing: I am dangerous. I'm dangerous because I won't stop telling the story. I'm dangerous because I won't pretend that policies designed to protect the organization's reputation are acceptable when they leave children vulnerable to predators. I'm dangerous because I've discovered that genuine faith sometimes requires leaving the religion that taught you about faith, that real courage means walking away from everything familiar when staying would compromise your conscience, that loving God and loving people sometimes means saying no to the organization that claims to speak for God. So that's what changed in 3 months. That's how I went from exemplary witness to expelled apostate, from pioneer to pariah, from faithful sister to dangerous warning tale. I discovered that children's safety mattered more than organizational reputation. I learned that asking questions wasn't apostasy but basic human decency. I found out that my 41 years of devoted service meant absolutely nothing the moment I prioritized protecting kids over protecting the institution. Would I do it again? Every single time. Every single day. Despite losing my children and grandchildren, despite the shunning and the loneliness and the need to rebuild my entire life at 57. Because Ethan matters. Isabella matters. The other 2 children who came forward matter. Every child who might be protected in the future because someone was willing to speak up matters more than my comfort, more than my standing, more than 41 years of investment in an organization that revealed its true priorities when I needed them to choose kids over policy. If you're watching this and you're still in the organization, if you're seeing things that don't align with what you've been taught about truth and love and protection, please know that asking questions doesn't make you wicked. If you've been abused or you know someone who has, please understand that reporting to authorities isn't a lack of faith in Jehovah but an act of courage that might save the next victim. If you're considering leaving but you're terrified of losing everyone, I won't lie and tell you it's easy, because it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'll tell you it's possible, and I'll tell you that life exists on the other side of fear, and I'll tell you that your conscience matters more than their approval. This is my story. This is what happened when I chose my grandson over my religion, when I chose truth over organizational loyalty, when I chose to become the dangerous apostate they warned everyone about. And if telling this story protects even one child, if it encourages even one person to trust their conscience over institutional pressure, if it lets even one survivor know they're not alone, then losing everything was worth it. Because some things matter more than everything. It's been 2 years since that June afternoon when Jennifer called me from Manchester Children's Hospital, 2 years since my world fractured into before and after, 2 years since I learned that everything I'd built my life upon had fault lines I'd never been allowed to examine. I'm 59 now, sitting in a small cafe in Chorlton that I've claimed as my own, a space where nobody knows me as the apostate or the troublemaker or the cautionary tale, where I'm just Margaret who comes in every Wednesday morning for black coffee and quiet time to write. Robert and I are still together, still processing, still grieving on the difficult days and rebuilding on the better ones. He found work at a different warehouse across town, started fresh where nobody knew his history as an elder, or his wife's reputation as a dangerous woman who dared to question organizational authority. We've made new friends slowly, carefully, people who don't require us to believe specific doctrines or attend specific meetings or maintain specific appearances. We joined a community center where we volunteer on Saturdays, the same day we used to go door-to-door offering magazines. The irony isn't lost on either of us. Ethan is 9 now. I haven't seen him in person since 3 weeks after his disclosure, haven't held him or heard his voice or watched him grow from a traumatized 7-year-old into whatever young person he's becoming. Jennifer sends occasional updates through a third party, a cousin who left the organization years ago, and maintains contact with both sides of our fractured family. Ethan is in therapy. He's doing better some days and worse on others. He asks about me sometimes, my cousin says, asks why Nana Maggie doesn't visit anymore, why I stopped loving him. Jennifer tells him I made choices that separated me from Jehovah's family, and I imagine my grandson trying to understand why protecting him from abuse was a choice that required punishment, why his grandmother's love for him meant she had to disappear from his life completely. Brother Marcus Fletcher was convicted in criminal court 14 months ago. 4 counts of sexual assault against minors, 2 counts of indecent images, 1 count of grooming. He received 8 years in prison, which felt simultaneously like justice and like a completely inadequate response to the destruction he'd caused in 4 children's lives. The local newspaper covered the trial, and the articles mentioned he was affiliated with a religious congregation but didn't name Jehovah's Witnesses specifically. The Kingdom Hall continued operating exactly as before, no public acknowledgement, no policy changes, no congregational discussion about how a ministerial servant had abused children for years while organizational policies protected him instead of his victims. 3 more families left our congregation after Fletcher's conviction, families who couldn't reconcile what had happened with what they'd been taught about Jehovah's clean organization and divinely appointed elders. Sarah was one of them. She calls me every Sunday morning now, and we have coffee and talk about the week and process our shared trauma and laugh about things that aren't actually funny except they are because humor is sometimes the only way to survive catastrophic loss. She lost her daughter and son-in-law to shunning, lost her grandchildren just like I lost mine, lost 43 years of certainty in a single moment of moral clarity. I started a blog 8 months ago, anonymously at first, then gradually more publicly as I realized that silence protected the system while speaking up might protect someone else's grandchild. I write about organizational policies and abuse cover-ups and the courage required to leave when leaving costs everything. I receive messages weekly from current and former Jehovah's Witnesses, some thanking me for articulating what they couldn't say, some cursing me for spreading apostate lies, some desperately asking for advice about how to navigate doubt when doubt feels like betrayal of everything they've ever known. One message stays with me, arrives in my inbox on the 2-year anniversary of Ethan's disclosure. It's from a woman in Australia, in Brisbane actually, the city where I was baptized at 16 with such certainty and hope and conviction that I was choosing the only true religion. She says she's a pioneer, has been for 12 years, has recently discovered concerning information about organizational abuse policies. She says she's terrified to ask questions, terrified to speak up, terrified of losing her family if she voices her doubts. She says she found my blog and wants to know if it's really as bad as I describe, if I really lost everyone, if there's any way to navigate this without catastrophic consequences. I write back honestly. I tell her yes, it's that bad and sometimes worse. I tell her I lost my children and grandchildren and 4 decades of friendship and community. I tell her the grief comes in waves that still knock me down 2 years later, that I still dream about field service and wake up disoriented, that I still instinctively calculate what meeting I should be getting ready for before remembering I don't go to meetings anymore. But I also tell her that I can look at myself in the mirror now without feeling like I'm complicit in harm, that I sleep at night knowing I prioritize protecting children over protecting reputation, that I've discovered a kind of peace that I never found in 41 years of doing everything right according to organizational standards. I tell her that choosing conscience over comfort is the hardest thing she'll ever do, and that she's the only one who can decide if the cost is worth paying. I tell her I can't promise it gets easier, but I can promise it gets different, and different might eventually feel like its own kind of better. I tell her that regardless of what she decides, she's not alone, she's not crazy, and asking questions doesn't make her wicked or weak or worthy of punishment. Michael sent me a letter 6 months ago, mailed to my address but with no return address, no signature, just his handwriting that I'd recognize anywhere. He said he thinks about me often. He said he misses me in ways he can't fully acknowledge without compromising his standing in the congregation. He said he hopes I'm well, hopes I'll eventually return to Jehovah, hopes this separation isn't permanent. He didn't say he was wrong to shun me. He didn't say he questioned the policies that require him to treat his mother as if she's dead. He didn't say he'd chosen organizational loyalty over basic human decency, and perhaps that choice deserved examination. But he also didn't have to write it all, and the fact that he did means something I haven't fully processed yet, something that feels like the tiniest crack in an otherwise impenetrable wall. I haven't responded because I don't know what to say that wouldn't make things harder for him. I keep the letter in my nightstand drawer, take it out sometimes on difficult nights, try to find hope in the fact that he reached out at all. Maybe someday he'll find the courage to choose relationship over religion. Maybe someday he'll realize that Jehovah, if Jehovah exists at all, would never require a son to abandon his mother for protecting her grandson. Maybe someday. But I can't live my life waiting for maybe, can't put my healing on hold hoping my children will eventually prioritize love over loyalty to an organization that doesn't deserve their devotion. Robert and I talk about God sometimes, about whether we still believe, about what faith means after religious trauma, about whether spirituality can exist independent of organized religion. We don't have answers, just questions that feel more honest than the certainty we used to carry. We visit different churches occasionally, sit in the back and observe, trying to determine if we're looking for community or just processing what we lost. Sometimes I feel something that might be spiritual connection, might be hope, might just be nostalgia for a time when everything felt simple and clear and absolutely certain. I've started painting, something I never had time for during 41 years of pioneering and meeting attendance and organizational obligations. I'm terrible at it. Create abstract pieces that don't look like anything recognizable but somehow capture feelings I can't articulate with words. Robert builds furniture in our spare room, creates beautiful practical pieces from raw wood, finds meditation in the careful measuring and cutting and sanding. We're learning who we are outside the organization, discovering interests and hobbies and aspects of ourselves that were suppressed under the weight of constant religious obligation. The hardest days are still the holidays and special occasions, the birthdays we're now allowed to celebrate but don't fully know how to enjoy because 40 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. Jennifer's birthday in March, Michael's in September, Ethan's in November, Isabella's in April, all marked on a calendar I can't ignore but can't participate in. Robert and I go out to dinner on those days, toast to children and grandchildren we love but can't contact, sit with grief that has no resolution because the people we're grieving haven't died but have chosen to treat us as if we have. But there are good days too, moments when I feel genuinely grateful for the courage that cost me everything but gave me back my integrity. Days when I receive messages from survivors who say my story helped them find their voice, helped them report abuse, helped them understand they weren't alone or crazy or exaggerating their trauma. Days when Sarah and I laugh until we cry about the absurdity of our former lives, about the rules we followed so meticulously, about the fear that controlled every decision. Days when Robert takes my hand across our kitchen table and says he'd choose this difficult, honest life with me over a comfortable, dishonest one in the congregation, and I believe him because I feel exactly the same way. I saw Jennifer at the supermarket 3 months ago, the first time I'd seen her in person since the disfellowshipping announcement. She was in the produce section with Ethan, who's gotten so tall, who looked so much older than the 7-year-old I remembered. I froze, completely unprepared for the surge of longing and grief and love that overwhelmed me. Ethan saw me first, and his face lit up with recognition before Jennifer grabbed his hand and steered him away, down a different aisle, without ever making eye contact with me. I stood there holding a bag of apples, tears streaming down my face in the middle of the produce section, grieving for my grandson who remembered me, who smiled at me, who was taught he had to ignore me because organizational policy required it. I left my shopping cart and walked out of the store, sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Robert held me that evening while I cried harder than I'd cried since those first weeks after the disfellowshipping, and he didn't try to fix it or minimize it or suggest any timeline for when this should hurt less. He just held me and acknowledged that some losses don't heal, they just become scars we learn to carry with more grace over time. But here's what I've learned in these 2 years of being a dangerous apostate. Sometimes breaking is the only path to becoming whole. Sometimes losing everything is the price of finding yourself. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is walk away from the religion that taught you about faith, because genuine spirituality requires honesty more than it requires allegiance to organizations that protect predators and punish protectors. I don't know if I'd call myself a Jehovah's Witness anymore, don't know if I'd call myself Christian, don't know what label fits this space I occupy now. But I know I'm a grandmother who chose her grandson's safety over organizational reputation. I know I'm a woman who found her voice at 57 after 41 years of learned silence. I know I'm someone who'd rather live with the consequences of doing right than the comfort of staying silent about wrong. And on my best days, the days when the grief isn't crushing, when hope feels possible, when I allow myself to imagine futures I can't yet fully envision, I know that somewhere in this messy, painful, courageously honest life I'm building, there's more truth than I ever found in 4 decades of believing I had all the answers. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is tell the truth. And sometimes being dangerous is exactly what the world needs. My name is Margaret Ann Thompson. I'm 59 years old. I was baptized at 16 and disfellowshipped at 57 for choosing child protection over organizational loyalty. I lost my children, my grandchildren, my community, and 41 years of certainty. And I'd do it all again tomorrow. Because some things matter more than everything, and protecting children is one of them. This is still my story. This is still what happens when conscience collides with control, when truth encounters institutions that claim monopoly on truth, when ordinary people find extraordinary courage to say no to systems that demand obedience at any cost. And if you're reading this wondering whether you have that courage too, wondering whether you can survive losing everything for the sake of integrity, I want you to know that you're stronger than you realize, braver than you've been allowed to believe, and worthy of a life built on honesty instead of fear. So comment below with your city. Tell me where you're reading from. Tell me if this resonates, if you're still in, if you've left, if you're considering leaving, if you know someone who needs to hear that it's possible to survive this. Because we survive together, we heal together, we build new lives together, and we refuse to stay silent about the truths that powerful institutions want desperately to keep hidden. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing my story. Thank you for being brave enough to hear what others would prefer you never knew. And remember, being called dangerous by people protecting harmful systems isn't an insult. It's confirmation that you're doing exactly what needs to be done.